but
Okay.
I think that one of the most important. Now I'm recording. I didn't
Okay.
record the previous session, so could you?
Okay.
It's a good practice. We'll do it again at a different time.
Or
But here, let me show you this. This is
Okay.
Dr. Nevin's little pamphlet that he wrote, Dr. Alexei Carrel, Medical Marvel and Moral Monster. And I met with Dr. Nevins in New Jersey. He didn't get this far. He did not realize that there might be a connection. And but he was disturbed by other things that Carrel was doing.
So just
I will tell you,
just to ask you for another minute, tell us again how you can handle the idea that Carrel and Lindbergh engaged in vivisection of a child. I know Elias, wasn't that his name? The fellow that you mentioned, I think it was Dr. Elias, the commissioner.
Ellis, Dr.
Commissioner
Ellis.
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 Yeah. Most people have read the book, The Immortalists by David Friedman, and that letter that you say has been stolen or lost or purged by Lindbergh or whoever, the letter is printed in Immortalist, and Milton mentions it in her book, asking Lindbergh and Carrel, when are you going to come down for, how does
we have feeble-minded prospects for you.
Right.
And I found the context to be different than Friedman. Friedman understood that to mean human vivisection. He thought that it was only prospective, and it doesn't appear to be that to me. It appears to be in the context of a relationship where he was comfortable asking him when they're coming, essentially again. And you have in Parker's book that he operated on an infant, Parker did, for his experiments.
That wasn't in the book.
1931.
Mom, just a minute. That wasn't in the book. That was in the April 32 report. The infants.
Okay, they referred to it in the 32 report, but in any event, none of these. Well, Carrel was not a medical doctor in terms of having the right to see patients. He was never authorized in New York or New Jersey to see patients.
He wasn't certified.
He only operated for scientific research.
Oh wow, that's true.
Now he once operated on an infant with the consent of her father, right, way back when, but it was illegal. It was just the doctor let him do that because he wanted to try to save her life. But he had no medical license in New York or New Jersey. He gave it up when he was in Illinois. So you have to understand that any time that he talks about human subjects, he's talking about scientific research. And when you look at what he wrote in his diary about how others who were only working with dead bodies were way behind the times, and you could learn so much more, you have to put it all together, and with his recommendation that others join in vivisection, human vivisection, expressly in his book in 1938. And he says, here are some of my prior experiments, and then he brags to reporters about how every organ has been tested. You wind up, I will tell you this, when I saw that Friedman had written a book called The Immortalists about the two of them and their experiments, I was so taken aback that I couldn't read it for several years, because I realized that little Charlie could have been one of them, and I just didn't want to be reading about that. It took me a long time. I had a break of several years before I went back to this book, because it's so horrifying. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
And in fact, apparently those feeble-minded prospects were others that it happened to. And Jamie did some amazing research about the Skillman village. And of course, that letter only referred to a different Vineland. It didn't refer to Skillman. But they were similar institutions. Jamie did research on Skillman, and the reports for Somerset County, where Skillman is located, of investigated deaths, because they looked odd and maybe were suicides or maybe were murders or whatever. Investigated deaths were in two categories. One was every place else but Skillman Village, and the other category was Skillman Village.
Wow.
And we have a long footnote about that
Wow.
because they let other doctors come in and do experiments about pneumonia and whatever. But Skillman Village's reputation was rapidly going downhill. And Dr. Nevins refers to a doctor there who questioned the ethics of what was going on there years earlier. So it was also a context in which doctors were not questioned, and institutional heads had full control over whoever was in their institution. So it all fits, and you just have to open your mind to an ugly, horrible possibility, and then you look at the evidence and it all fits. What Jamie found about the detritus by the corpse is shocking, but it's medical laboratory garbage that is associated with those kinds of operations. And including, Jamie found that the gloves that were found there had a worn holes in the index finger and in the middle finger. And she figured out that that was likely from repetitive stitching using needles, and it had these little holes. And there was an article in Time magazine in 1935 about Carrel and lauding him because he was considered, next to Einstein, the most marvelous doctor in America. He had this special technique that he used for vascular surgery, microsurgery, where instead of having a holder like other doctors would do, he just used his fingers, and apparently with gloves, I don't know, but he used his middle finger and his index finger, which other people did not do, other doctors did not do.
Wow.
So you put all this together, it's only our own reticence to absorb something so horrific that stands in the way of logic.
Well, and you have to take into consideration, like, just the context of the times. Yes, like it's horrendous to think about that any doctor could do something like this, but back then they didn't have any ethics. There were no ethics back then. It was only after the Nazi trials that they actually started to think about it, which was, 10 years after the fact, or whenever, several years after. But
there was public disapproval, and so there were people who pushed back, so they were very secretive. You could not get in to the Rockefeller Institute without special permission. What they did was pretty secretive, and they were not broadcasting that they were using humans for vivisection. But on the other hand, when the new leadership at the Rockefeller Institute in 1935 tried to get rid of Carrel's team and succeeded in disbanding his team, Carrel was looking for others to replicate his experiments. So he encouraged Parker to write his how-to book, and he wrote his own book in 38, trying to get other medical researchers to carry on human vivisection. And he said that expressly.
It was for the good of science. And
Right.
until the trials at Nuremberg, very few people questioned. They questioned the treatment of animals with
Right,
the
they
vivisection.
did. Yeah. But he tries to be cagey in his book, in his 38 book, where he refers to it a little bit and then he backs off and you're not quite sure what he's talking about. But then at the end, he says, I recommend this highly, you've got to develop this more than we've started, but you've got to take it further. And he said, some people will worry about it being quasi-criminal or something, or it's like, wow.
Right. The part of your book describing why the corpse was not at the location for very long with the vermin, that was something I had never actually considered, and I always believed the corpse was never there until,
Well, Dr. Smith is amazing. I told him he's a modern Sherlock Holmes, but
that was very good research.
He consulted with other specialists, and he had 2,000 autopsies to his own name. And he said there were some parts of that time were perfect conditions for maggots, and there were none on the corpse. None.
None. Yeah. So the look-see was a farce. And
that's another thing. It was illegal under New Jersey law to cremate a homicide victim because they were looking for whoever did it, and they need that evidence. But Lindbergh had so much power that they just said, okay, you want to cremate him, fine.
I think something else that's important to bring up is that a lot of the evidence, even in the squib report and the autopsy, doesn't exist anymore. Like the only bones that were left for Dr. Bass, who wrote another affidavit for the book, the only bones that were left to actually observe after 32, when the rest of the corpse was cremated.
Okay.
The
Sorry,
taking of the Lindbergh family is,
Sorry. Sorry. One second.
yeah,
Jamie, you can turn it off. There were 10 bones, hand and foot bones, and there were 2 what turned out to be bird bones that were left because they were found in the soil and they were kept by the squib lab. They were not part of the remains that were cremated. And that's the only reason they were left, and they were left as evidence. And Anna Hauptmann essentially hired Dr. Bass to come and check it out. And when he checked it out, he noticed that the bird bones had been gnawed, but
Right.
the human bones had not. And
Right.
it didn't occur to him to question what happened to the child or when it happened, because he never saw the autopsy, the look-see autopsy. He never saw any other reports. He only did that 1 hour of analysis at the basement of the New Jersey State Police Museum. But he kept photos, so he shared those photos, and we have those in the book of the bones that he examined. And he considers my theory quite plausible. And he's the founder of the Body Farm.
right.
So
And there were no gnawed parts of the child's, but the parts that belonged to the corpse. There were no teeth marks of any animal on them.
well, right, but they had very few bones there. But here's what's interesting about the bones they found and what they didn't find. 2 major things. One of them is that there was one bone, and it's unclear whether it was a hand or foot bone because they were mingled afterward. But there was one bone found in the burlap bag, and it was in the same condition as the bones on the ground. That means fleshless,
Right.
okay, and of the same age and belonging to a child of 18 to 24 months. That's what he determined. Well, there's a real problem. If Hauptmann had put the kid in a burlap bag and he died on the premises, and then he was dumped that same night in the woods south of Hopewell, there is no blood that they ever found in the burlap bag, and they looked for it. And there was no flesh ever in the burlap bag. It was the same condition as the others on the ground, which means that that bone traveled in that burlap bag long after death. That's what it means. And if you look at the soil and the leaves, they also found no evidence of blood in the soil. You cannot have a wild animal tearing apart a body without leaving blood. But you also, if you had a wild animal, it would not leave the body as compact as that one was, face down with the face protected. Dr. Speth says they would attack the head. And also the bones would be scattered. I had the head of the Oakland Zoo look at those photos from the site in the woods and said that is not how you would expect a wild animal to leave a corpse.
Wow.
So you have no blood, you have no maggots, you have no scattered body, and all you have is somebody assuming that it was a wild animal when there's zero proof of any wild animal attack. But there's plenty of evidence of medical lab detritus.
Well, the first time that, that is posited that an animal had attacked the bones is William Allen's statement, to police. William Allen's not a doctor. He's the truck driver.
Right.
He was the one that found the body. So in his statement from May 12th, he says, he gives his thoughts about what happened to the corpse based on his observations. And he says that it either had been severely deteriorated or had been attacked by wild animals. That's not an informed opinion. That's just a guess. And everybody who's studied this case since then has used that as gospel because he was the first one to say it. But he's not a doctor. He's not an expert. He's just saying what he thought happened because he couldn't explain it otherwise. So people need to think about who is actually saying these things, if they're an expert or not. Just
But
because
the
they
that's
think,
cops followed. The cops should have known better, and they allowed that myth to continue.
yeah.
Right. But
Obviously
the
untrue. There were no maggots. Everybody knows what. I mean, I've been watching forensic files for 20 years. Anybody today knows when they find a corpse in the woods, they go through.
Well, here's the thing. Walsh testified at Hauptmann's trial that there was a veil of vermin, which we assume he means maggots. He testified to that, Walsh.
Did?
But he did. But that was 2.5 years later.
Yeah,
And I think it's because he knew there should have been.
should have been,
Because
right.
what happened at the time is there were multiple police reports. Nobody mentioned that. But instead what you got is William Allen saying, me and my coworker, we studied the face for 5 minutes. The two first troopers said the same thing. We studied it. It turned from white to blue. You cannot study something that's in a veil of vermin.
Right.
And there was no such thing. The reporter who took the photo at the morgue that night commented that there were no maggots. So you have all these other people, including Walsh, who wrote a report that dated that same day that did not mention any maggots whatsoever. And wasn't in the morgue. They don't mention any from the doctor or the coroner. And Walsh, who's lied about other things, apparently lied about that at trial. And one of the things he lied about clearly at trial is where they found the burlap bag. He said the burlap bag was found by the corpse, which was a lie, and he knew it. He was one of the chief investigators, one of the two troopers who found it by the side of the road. It was seen there also by Harry Wolf, who is the head of the Hopewell police chief. He had seen it there, and the two younger troopers brought it with them to where the corpse was and put it down before they went off on other business. And so Walsh knew that. He knew that it had been transported. He read their reports. And so he pretended at Hauptmann's trial that it was found by the corpse. Why would he do that? Because it might have occurred to the jury that it would be really odd for a burlap bag on the shoulder of the road to sit there for 2 months when there were extensive searches done in that whole 5-mile radius and nobody noticed it.
Mm.
I don't think it was there until very late. And of course, with only one little fleshless bone in it, it seems obvious that the child did not travel in that bag until long after death.
Right. Wow. I've learned so much from your book.
Thank you.
It's truly remarkable that you even remember what you wrote.
Yeah.
But the issue of how the child died is so obviously what makes Hauptmann's trial a travesty of justice. He should have walked out of that court. He never should have been extradited, but that's another story. However, when Riley agreed, as we all know, he agreed that that was Lindbergh's child found in the woods. It was the end of everything.
Well, that was what's interesting also, because Fisher, Lloyd Fisher, who was sat second chair, was all prepared with experts that I think were orchestrated by Ellis Parker to talk about the partial embalming. And I assume, because we don't have the record, that they were talking about the face, because the face should not have been preserved. Dr. Speth has described that the first thing that happens in a freeze-thaw situation is you have more deterioration on the surface than you have internally. And this was the opposite. The face was preserved. And so that was odd. So he said and it also turned from white to blue while they were there, which was odd. And the rest of the body was so deteriorated, it was mostly skeletal, except for the right foot, which is also odd. How could the left foot all be fleshless bones scattered around and the right foot still be intact? Well, it was what Betty Gow used to identify it. And you could also tell that she could identify him from the face. So it looks purposeful in order for there to be identification so that, I think, so that Ann Morrow would have closure, Ann Morrow Lindbergh.
Yes.
Because she might not believe it otherwise.
And then she would spend the rest of her life looking for her child. Yes, it had to come to an end. He had to be definitely identified. I agree. That's obviously why his face would be preserved. But the leathered condition of he was partially embalmed, or the
Well,
body was-
well, it might have been tannic acid. There were several people connected with the case who were familiar with its properties, because it's used in taxidermy, it's used in
Leather tanning.
in the lab,
leather tanning. Yeah.
leather tanning, it's used in Corell's lab, or it could have been another chemical. But the fact of the matter is that there's something extremely unusual about the preserved face turning from white to blue before Zapolsky's eyes.
Right.
He turned it over, it was white, well, sort of white, probably flesh-colored Caucasian. And then it turned blue. And he testified to that at Hauptmann's trial.
Right.
Unfortunately,
what you can see from the pictures that exist now is that the picture from the death scene or in the woods, you can see that the facial features are much more recognizable than the picture from the morgue. So you can just tell, even in black and white where you can't see color, you can see that the face is a lot more defined and a lot lighter in the picture taken at the scene of the woods versus the picture in the morgue, which was taken that same night. So there's definitely, to me anyway, a visible change in the face between that afternoon and that evening.
Right.
And people can look at this for themselves from the pictures that are in the book. So.
Yeah, they're very obvious. There are a number of these pictures. I think there are actually 3 or 4 photos of the corpse. What was I going to say? The hole in the skull, is that possible to make a hole with a stick, as Zapolsky claimed he had done? Is that possible?
well, it wasn't Zapolsky who claimed it, it was actually Walsh who claimed it. And he claimed it because Keaton wouldn't, which is very interesting, because when they had the grand jury in the Bronx, Scheffel, I think is his name, testified that Keaton was the one who poked the hole, and he did it when he was helping the coroner remove the body. And then Keaton never came forward and said that. And then 2 months later, Walsh came forward and said, no, it was me, and I poked a hole. And in between, Dr. Mitchell was interviewed by the reporters, and he's quoted in the newspaper saying there's no way that could be done. The skull is way too hard at that point. You couldn't poke a hole with a stick that way. Right. And he at that time was more convinced that it was a bullet. And so they started looking for a bullet in the area of the woods to see if maybe it was still there. And they never found one. But now we have Dr. Speth indicating that maybe it was a drill. Maybe it was a drill for another experiment on the child as hydrocephalic. But unfortunately, in the context, I don't think it was intended to save his life. It was just intended for further scientific experimentation, if it happened, which we don't know.
Well, and then you have another medical expert opinion from, I think it was a PBS special that came out in 2013. I think it's called "Who Killed Lindbergh's Baby" or something like that. But they have a retired pathologist who's I think his expertise. He was a state pathologist, I think, for North Carolina. I think his name is John Betts. I want to say Dr. Betts. And he gave his medical expert opinion. One of his expertise was child deaths. And child, murders. And he said that there's no way that a stick could make that hole. It's too round. So you have a medical expert opinion, a modern medical expert opinion, and a medical expert opinion from the state's physician saying that there's no way that could have happened. So you have 2 experts from 2 different eras saying no way that could have happened.
And his opinion was that the most likely way it could have happened is with a blunt instrument to the right side of the head while the child was lying on a hard surface, so that it would fracture on the opposite side. And I consulted another forensic pathologist who reached that same conclusion, but neither one of them considered what Dr. Speck does realize, which is that Corell actually drilled holes when he was doing his operations on dogs, and that was mirrored by another doctor operating on a small child using a drill to make a hole of that size. So we don't know, but that's a possibility that hasn't been explored before.
Another thing in your book that I was interested in, the black rubber pieces that are found, where you figured out that because Carell, he used black robes, they covered themselves in black. I don't know the origin of that thinking, but he was psychic. He believed in psychic phenomenon and all kinds of supernatural nonsense, which is another reason Lindbergh admired him. His wife dowsed for water in France. She took twigs and looked for water. I mean, they were crazy
Right.
people.
It wasn't just that, though. Black also made a dust very visible. And he was very concerned all the time about a pristine environment, because before Lindbergh improved the device that he was using, the pump, everything he tried to keep became decayed very quickly. And so it died within a few days, and it was because it got bacteria in it. And so he was very worried about that, but they wore black rubber gloves. And what we found was that there were tiny little black particles that are consistent with black rubber gloves. We don't know for sure that's what it was, that are found on the underside of the buttons on the Dr. Denton's that the child wore. Now that was not found by the corpse. That was actually mailed back to Jaffe in March, about around March 19, 1932. And Lindbergh immediately said, "This is my son's. This proves the kidnapper sent this back." And that was what he was wearing when he disappeared. Well, actually, if that's the case, then what Lindbergh just did was implicate a medical lab technician in undressing his son before he died.
Well, Lindbergh wasn't there when they put the kid to sleep. How would he know what he was wearing? This is in Aldrin and Monia's book mentions this.
Right. He couldn't know for sure because he wasn't there that night. On the other hand, they had just bought several matching Dr. Denton. So, I mean, but the fact is, he's saying, yes, this proves they're the kidnappers, whether he knew or he didn't know. Actually, Schwarzkopf said, "How do we know that? I don't think you can tell us that." So he questioned it more, but Lindbergh did not. But Lindbergh was not realizing that what he was doing was implicating medical technicians because there were little black particles. Hauptmann didn't have that.
Right.
No. And it was the Squibb report that said that they looked like rubber. It wasn't, that's on our supposition.
Oh, they said it looked like rubber.
Yeah.
Right.
They said it looked like rubber. Yeah.
But they drew no conclusions. And one of the things about the Squibb report is that they said nothing of interest here. And that was not true. There was plenty of interest there. And the police actually re-examined it in 1977 and said the same thing. They doubled down and said nothing of interest here. It doesn't contradict what Hauptmann's conviction. And it does contradict it, because that burlap bag did not have a body in it that had blood.
Right.
Okay.
Or other liquids.
That burlap bag.
Liquids, right.
Yeah. And the other evidence indicates that from Dr. Speth's analysis that the body couldn't have been there very long, and it was artificially preserved in the face and on the right foot. And how did that happen between the time you couldn't do that all on the night of March 1 before the police put up a blockade? That was not physically possible, even if he had any of that expertise, which he did not.
And I think what people need to understand is that Squibb wasn't just some podunk, science lab. They were the premier science lab in the country. So for them to say there's nothing here when it's pretty obvious that there is, and the way that they describe things, like, for instance, they use scientific measurements, meaning metric, when it suits their purposes for the weights of the unidentified objects. So they have like 6 large pieces of solid waste that they never define except for how much it weighs, which is not scientific at all. But the measurements they use are grams, which is metric. But everything else for the measurements, they use imperial, so inches and feet. And one of the things that that kind of drew my attention is because I've taken a couple science classes. I'm not like a true scientist. I've had to take some classes for college, but I know in science labs they do everything in metric because that's the scientific standard, especially with you know, litmus paper. Litmus paper comes in millimeters. It doesn't come in inches. But when you see, like for me, what really tipped me off was the fact that there was a strip of purple paper. They didn't say it was torn. They said it was a strip. And they said, and as for one thing, why would they have purple paper in the Depression, in a rural community, in the woods? Why would there be a strip of purple paper? And I was like, well, so I thought about, if I converted the inches, the measurements to millimeters, would it make more sense? And so I did, and it's like, oh, this matches the standard size of litmus paper. It's like, oh, wait a minute.
Which the Squib Lab sold regularly in that color. There were other things there that were obvious. Like, for example, they found a disc coated with something that looked like blood but wasn't blood, okay? The size of the disc, Jamie translated into millimeters. It was the standard size of a mica disc.
Cover slip.
A cover slip that they used under a microscope, and that's exactly what Carell used, and it was used, and it's described
for their experiments.
For their experiments, and it was big news that they were working with a serum derived from blood that is not the same as blood because it was missing, you know, part of it that was separated in the centrifuge.
And they added phenol red to it to make it so they could see it.
It was huge news. It was huge news in April of '32. And the fellow who ran this lab at Squib Lab was doing similar experiments and creating plasma for polio victims. So he was knowledgeable.
Right.
And yet they didn't describe anything in scientific terms, or they obfuscated it.
They obfuscated it. So they had political attitude. They were afraid of Lindbergh. Why would Squib?
I don't think they were afraid. I think they were of the same mindset. When Carell was forced by the Rockefeller Institute to disband his staff, they were hired by Squib.
Oh,
yeah,
a good chunk of them.
Oh, wow.
And Squib created its own institute in the late 30s based on the Rockefeller's model, and they hired Parker, who wrote the Methods of Tissue Culture, who was one of the integral members of Carell's team.
Right.
He was the one that described all the materials used for their carotid artery experiments. They hired Parker, Squib hired Parker as the director of their new lab.
And he brought over other employees. He brought over other lab employees from.
But they were doing the same thing, and they had because you know, polio was such a big thing back then, and other diseases, and Dr. John Anderson, who was the one who wrote that cover letter for the report, who was the director at the time, he actually was one of the first directors of what is now the National Institute of Health. So he was a government scientist, medical research doctor before Squib. So he had connections too, but he was way up there. I mean, he was like one of the premier research scientists in the country. But he had a similar mindset to Carell, because he was asked about, you know, using animals, you know, sacrificing animals for research. And he said, you know, it's necessary. We need to do this just to cure polio. So they thought that, because at the time they used horses, you know, where they infected horses intentionally to get the serum, but they were like back then there was no real ethical standards. As long as it benefited, as the research benefited humanity, right, or the deserving humanity, the deserving humanity, then anything goes. So yeah, John Anderson and another doctor who was listed in the report, I forget his name. I think it's George something, but it was another doctor who was mentioned as studying whether or not there was human blood or yeah, I think human blood in the materials they found. George Leonard, he was the other doctor. They both had been doing research with various animals, I think including human, for serum studies. So they were doing the exact same things that Carell was doing. And so if they, I think they knew that if they said, wait a minute, this points to Carell, this points to Lindbergh, then they would have been incriminating themselves too, because that they would recognize that their research would probably be shut down too.
Well, maybe. I don't know that we have proof of anybody else doing human experiments except for Parker, who wrote about it. But they were doing the animal vivisections, and they were legal at that point in New Jersey in the 30s.
Oh, that's, yeah, I overspoke there. I don't know if we have any evidence that Anderson and Leonard were working with humans, but we do know that they were doing the serum studies where they should have recognized what they saw on the disc, where they should have recognized what that was, or at least hypothesized about what it could have been, because it was the same stuff that they were doing with the phenol and with the and with blood serum is something they should have recognized. But they were of the same mindset. So yeah.
Well, it was the era of eugenics. You all know, from the 1880s up until Hitler, people are not going to understand the nature of what happens when you think this way. It's only after Nuremberg, the trials and the exposure of the Holocaust that people begin to get ashamed to some degree. Cold Spring Harbor is still, I don't know what they're still doing out there in Long Island. Yeah. But some of these scientists actually did apologize for their thinking after the war, after World War II. But we only have 2 minutes, and I wanted to ask Lisa if Governor Hoffman had wanted to, do you think he could have made Lindbergh take a hearing test? Did he have the authority? Did he have the authority to do that?
Well, he didn't really get involved until after the trial.
Right, but they left the country when it was.
And they left the trial, so it wasn't really possible to do that. But his hearing was impaired, I believe, in the 40s. It was recorded that it had been impaired, and his hearing would have been more likely to have been impaired than Ann's. So it's very suspect what his good buddy told J. Edgar Hoover about how her hearing was not good. She seemed to have fairly acute hearing. There are a lot of issues that we discuss in the book, and they're all footnoted. And I just want to say that I'm happy to debate with anybody what our findings are. I did not go down that path having a strong idea where it would lead originally, but when I found it, I wasn't afraid of it. No. And everything that I found was consistent with the theory that I have put forward, and that is shocking. It's of great concern. But it seems to me to explain everything that happened, whereas lots of other theories leave lots of loose ends.
Right, and based on your research, I understand why you came up with that scenario that you described at the very end. It is shocking, but the fact you've shown why you didn't make it up like Jim Fisher, just we started talking about, he's made up stuff and he sticks by it. He's a fundamentalist. I call him the fundamentalist.
Let me just add one thing. In 1935, Carell wrote an international bestseller, and his book included saying that weakling children deserve to die. And he had other categories of people who engaged in serial felonies and various other categories, mentally deficient. And